There are so many different ways to monetize your podcast and grow your show strategically. Today's guest does something a little different than our typical guests. I know on this show we talk about listeners to leads, but what about guests to leads or guests to potential collaborators, connectors, people that can generate revenue with us and for us from our podcast connections? This is such a fun conversation, and I loved talking to Carol all about how she's able to make really meaningful connections with those who could refer business to her or she could refer business to them, all in the attempt to raise up the nonprofit sector. Please join me in welcoming Carol to the podcast. Hello, Carol. I am so excited to have you on the show today. If you could start by telling everyone who you are, what you do, and about your podcast.
Sure. And thank you so much for having me on. My name is Carol Hamilton. I'm the principal at Grace Social Sector Consulting, where I do equity-focused strategic planning and evaluation work for nonprofits and associations, mostly small to medium size with human-centered missions. And for that, I have a podcast called Mission Impact, where I talk to nonprofit experts and leaders about all things nonprofits. And the tagline for the podcast is helping you do good in the world without being a martyr to the cause.
For nonprofits, I'm assuming that's very important.
Very important.
Passionate.
And I'm still trying to unlearn that. So
Yes.
It's, like most things, like people talk about me search instead of research. And so I'm sure for any of us, whatever our podcast is, there's an element of it that's helping us with an issue.
Yes. I feel like with podcasting, not just with conversation, but even solo episodes, I feel like we learn so much about ourselves, the way we think, opening our eyes to the experiences of other people that we, in other situations, would never have been able to have really deep and meaningful conversations with. And I just love podcasting for that so much.
100%. Yeah. That's really what drew me to it. When I started my business back in 2017, I started, I was doing all the things that people say you should do. And so I was blogging and I, was successful with that and consistent, but I didn't love it. And I had been doing at the beginning a lot of informational interviews about what's it like to be a consultant. And before I kind of took the leap and made that transition. And that's actually where the idea for the podcast started. And yeah, so just being able to talk to people, I was like, I'm talking to folks anyway. I'm doing all this networking. I'm having these conversations. Why not record them and share them with other people so that everyone gets the chance to, meet these good people? Yeah. And then for me, the other thing has been, I think at the very beginning when I was like setting my goals for the podcast, I was like, okay, worst case scenario. If no one ever listens, what am I going to get out of this? And it was those deep conversations with people and really getting clear about how I think about things and exploring topics that I wouldn't have a chance to explore. And, luckily, worst case scenario hasn't played out. There are downloads, there are listeners. And yeah, it has helped me clarify how I think about the work that I do and explain it better, explain it more clearly, all those things.
I even think about how when I first launched my podcast, and even when I first started working in the podcasting space, I was very gung-ho about this idea that if you start a podcast, you have to keep podcasting. Like, oh, you want to do a limited series? Nope, bad idea. And as I've talked to people and as I've grown as just a person, realizing that there's no one or even two right ways to podcast, that everyone gets to decide what's right for them. And that's okay, right? If they want to do a limited series because of their capacity, then that's all right. And they can make it work and they can get the most out of it. But you just have to really be intentional. And having those conversations helped me shift my mind about something that I stood pretty firmly on originally. So I love that podcasting has the ability to help us really figure out where our values are And like,
Mm-hmm.
yes, I would say, oh yeah, keep doing a podcast, but no, like really digging deep into, well, what are my values? My values are get your voice out there. That is it. Like, it doesn't have to be
Right.
perfect. It
Right.
doesn't have to be an ongoing show. It could be something very simple. Have you found something like that where it's shifted your something that you really stood firmly on before?
Well, just in terms of kind of how I approached, the things that I was hearing when I first, it took me a long time to get started. Like I had this idea years before I got my setup and got a microphone and actually started recording. And I think a couple different things. I decided early on that I was going to do a cadence of every other week or twice a month. And there were points at which I got kind of, things were a little slower with client work. And so when I was hearing like, you should do once a week. And so I was like kind of tempted by that. And then I thought, no, I cannot get sucked into that because it will get busier again. And I know that I can keep this up. I can be consistent about that. I think, one of my superpowers is like being able to be consistent. So it works for me, right? That cadence. But I've experimented with lots of different episode types.
Mm.
I've done solo shows, which I find to be the hardest ones. I'm working on one right now. My 100th episode, I'll be doing a solo kind of, the top 10 things that I've learned from these 100 episodes about nonprofits. I've done those. I've done, I do mostly interview shows. I've done kind of best of. So I've, taken clips. Those have been really fun to do, but oh my God, so much
A lot of
work.
work.
A lot of work. I've had people back. So I have one person that comes on periodically and we do what we call a learning out loud episode. So it's kind of like having a co-host, but she's not a co-host all the time. So I've experimented with lots of different things and, not been that concerned about switching it up a little bit. And I think it helped over time to, at the beginning, I worked with a coach to help me get launched because I was just afraid of all the things, and I still work with an editor. I knew from the beginning that wasn't a skill set that I felt a burning need to acquire. So they do that and a lot of those social media stuff. So just figuring out what's going to work for you in terms of making it doable over time is really important.
Yeah, I could not agree more. And I love that you kind of had to like slap your hand a bit and be like, no, we're not doing every week. We are sticking
Right?
with what we've stuck with because you're right. It's so often we see people saying, do this or do this or do this. And we're like, well, it's slow now and I have space to do it. But at that point, just batch up. It's okay. You can keep recording them, right? Just don't release them
Yeah, I'm
anymore.
always way ahead.
Yes. So good. So before we got on, we were talking in the green room a bit about this idea of getting connections, collaborations, and potentially clients from your guests. Now, this is something that we've touched on briefly as a way to monetize your podcast. And I love this idea because as we were talking about how it's about the connection and creating a relationship with the other person. You're not there to, all right, I'm definitely going to sell to you. No, you're kind of just getting to know the person. So tell me a little bit more about what that process looks like for you.
Yeah, it was something that I definitely had to come to over time, but I was talking to other nonprofit consultants, whether they do, marketing or fundraising. I focus on strategic planning. They might be an executive coach. They might focus on board governance, all the different things that kind of go into running an organization and having an effective organization. And I was listening to another podcast, the company show that has these kind of, I think they call them blueprints of the different types of shows that are valuable when you're podcasting for your business. I think this was different than at the very beginning where I was in a lot of communities, podcast communities, where the majority of people were there as a hobby, and not doing it for their business. So finding that kind of niche of, no, there's a particular subset of folks who have a different kind of goal. And so one of their blueprints was the relationship building. So being able to focus on that and realize, okay, the biggest value that I get from the podcast and the business gets from the podcast is the relationship between me and the other person on this other side of the screen and in that conversation. So my focus is really on who I'm talking to. And so it's actually meant that I've made my workflow less efficient because I've added meetings, like a pre-meeting to talk to them, to get, have a chance to get to know them, help them feel more comfortable with get a focus on what we're going to talk about. I used to do that just through a form, which, worked, but didn't have that purpose of, let me take a minute to actually get to know this person a little bit better. And, then doing a little bit more to let them know kind of what the process is going to be afterwards. I've added things to and also going on to other people's shows has helped me learn like what I appreciated when I was a guest. So recently I had been on a show where, I've got my Calendly set up and the form and the reminders. The person I was going on their show, they had the same thing set up, but they had the reminder that's automatic. They had a whole thing of like, this is what you can expect as a reminder, because I'd sent all that information to folks, but it might have been a month before. And they've forgotten that, oh yes, I actually will use the video. So it's helpful to, have taken a shower that day.
Yeah.
And so I ended up with one person where we agreed we were not going to use the video because they were embarrassed about how they'd shown up. But I was like, oh, I need to give people a reminder the day before that that's what we're doing. And so they could show up as their best selves and feel comfortable, because for me, that's what I'm trying to do. I don't see myself as like a journalist where I'm trying to do the gotcha question. I tell them, I'm going to give you a couple softball questions and we're going to get rolling. We're going to have a conversation, because I want to learn what you know about. And I'm not here to
trap you.
Yeah. Trap you in any way. That is not my intention. That is not my goal. That doesn't serve anybody.
So I love this so much. And I'm already my brain's working about how I can shift my own process, especially since I've transitioned to video this year. Okay, add in that extra reminder. Like, yes, I have the one the day before of like, hey, your meeting's tomorrow. But having something in there that says, just a reminder, this is video, especially because I am at the point where I'm recording, months in advance.
Exactly.
It's like, this helps people. And so I love that so much. But I also love the pre-chat. Now, I am someone where my brain will just not work with a pre-chat. And that's okay, right? But I have a friend who's been on the show and talked about her process, and she has the pre-chat every time. And what that allows her to do is be able to not only organize her content in a way that makes sense for her audience, kind of like a through line throughout all of her content, but also helps her be able to, and she's a fantastic interviewer, pull the right information from the guest. Because when you're doing it off the fly, for myself, more conversational, kind of don't really know where the conversation is going to go. And I find that fun and exciting because I get to have, for me, more meaningful conversations. Whereas for her, she wants to make sure that the audience is in mind, that it's keeping them top of mind of like, what are their needs? What are their struggles? All right, let's make sure that we address and talk through these things that are really going to help my listeners. And it's really just a determination of what works best for you. And so I love that you were able to shift your process in a way that works for you. And then also, what I love about the building relationships part of it, podcasting is so intimate. Yes, it goes out and, whoever wants to listen to it can listen to it. But right here, right now, it's you and me. That is it. It's just two people having a conversation, getting to know each other. And what I love about podcasting versus lives or other forms is that the audience tends to be at the forefront, and for me, a distraction. So if I'm on live with someone, I'm looking at the chat or I'm thinking about this person that I know who might see it. Whereas here, it's just us. And so I feel like we can go a little deeper. We can talk a little bit more about things without thinking about who that listener is and who they're, what they might say, or, oh man, I hope my uncle doesn't hear this or whatever. Right. So I love that for podcasting. And I think it's just such an intimate experience that it creates a connection that's so much deeper than, oh, we did a live together. Cool. Because it's just us. Now, we were talking about how you're able to kind of move people either into connections or collaborators or maybe even potential clients? How has that worked for you?
Yeah. So my goal is really building referral partners. And so I'm connecting with people, mostly with other consultants who do complementary things to me and who work in the same space as I do, have similar values, but don't do exactly the same work that I do. And having them on the podcast, sometimes it's an opportunity to invite someone in. Sometimes I'm doing a swap with another podcast host who focuses on the nonprofit sector. But it's like a little mini project. And so I'm able to get to know them. I'm able to get to know kind of their work style and do they respond? Like I know I get to know a little bit more than just having a coffee chat with somebody, a virtual coffee chat. And so usually I've done that before. Usually I've met somebody in a networking situation, follow up one-on-one and have a conversation with them. It seems like we're vibing. So then I'll invite them onto the podcast. We do a pre-chat. And my goal there is just to, again, go a little deeper, get to know them a little more and pinpoint a few things that we'll focus on. But not to, sometimes we it's too easy to kind of fall into habit. It was like, wait a second, we should be recording this.
Yeah.
This is the good stuff. But it's more about helping them, especially if they've never, because I've had quite a few people who've never been on a podcast before on my show. And so helping them answer all those questions of what can they expect, et cetera. But then, that it gives me a chance to get to know them better because when you're trying to find people who you might refer work to, or they might refer work back, there's an element of your reputation that's built into that. And so you want to know someone a little bit better than just half an hour or just meeting them at a networking event. And through the podcast, I would say I have been, referred to work that isn't the work that something comes to them and it isn't appropriate, or they see something, they pass it along to me. Other speaking engagements, that's definitely been something that I've seen. Being invited onto other people's podcasts. So lots of different outcomes that have definitely been beneficial.
Yeah, I have also seen that. I recently got a client referral from someone who I had on my podcast 2 years ago. And we've just stayed connected on social media. I'll like her stuff sometimes. She'll like my stuff sometimes. And we just stay connected very loosely, right? But still connected.
Right.
And she referred me from one of her clients was looking for some podcast support. And she was like, oh yeah, I know someone who does that. And so like, what a great connection that I didn't go into that. Let's call it a relationship, right? I didn't go into that relationship thinking this person is going to have my ideal client or this person is going to, send me business, because then we wouldn't have had a unique and informative conversation. It would have been about what can I get from this?
Right,
and what you're talking about is a very reciprocal relationship, right? Because you obviously don't support the nonprofits with everything. So
no.
How can you support your clients in the best way possible? So you're keeping your clients in mind of like, how can I bring in and raise us all up as an industry, as service providers that are working in this industry, raise us all up to be able to support these people who are doing really passionate and impactful work. And when you go into it with that mindset, rather than they'll definitely have a client for me, it shifts the whole conversation.
Yeah, I mean, that's the ultimate goal, but if you put that front and center, it just ends up feeling really transactional. And in some swaps and some things, I've kind of experienced that. I'm like, okay, now I know that about that person. And so, okay, we're good. But yeah, no, I mean, I think it's really figuring out, is this person that I would trust my clients with? Is this a person that I would want to work with? So that's the other thing. I've ended up partnering on bigger projects with a number of people that I've had on who, again, either have complementary skills to mine and develop some really deeper partnerships over time with folks, and done other things like pulled people together to cooperate on LinkedIn, comment on others' posts, or, and so gotten to know people better through that. So there's lots of different ways. I think just the steps through of having someone on as a guest and I think probably I could strengthen my follow-up. That would be an area I could pay more attention to, but certainly getting connected to them on LinkedIn and then highlighting them when the show comes out, thanking them. And, sometimes at the end of the year, I'll thank everybody that's been on the show, just the different ways that you can kind of spotlight them and what they have to bring. And it's interesting you talked about that. What's the unique thing that you can offer? And that's actually two of my lessons from my 100 episodes. One of them is, it's all about relationships. I've heard that so many times on my podcast. Board governance, staff, volunteers, donors, all the things, policymakers. It's all about relationships. And then the second one is you don't have to do it all alone. And so those two things, and let's be human about all of it. I would say those three things are kind of the undergirding all of this for me.
Well, also congratulations on 100 episodes.
Thank you.
Not a lot of people get there. I want to say it's 6%. The number changes every month, but I want to say it's 6%. And I think it's just such a testament to being able to show up, especially every other week. And as I was thinking about what you were talking about, like the follow-up and the connections and staying connected. Now I have a weekly show. And I want to say maybe about 100 of those have been guests. And that has been difficult, right? To keep track of all of those guests and to stay connected.
No, I'm not keeping in touch with everybody.
Right.
But yeah.
But I think that having a bi-weekly show, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, maybe has allowed you to stay better connected. Because you're able to maybe promote their episode a little longer, or you're able to keep them top of mind for a little longer. Whereas as I'm churning out weekly content, I'm like, all right, on to the next, on to the next. I think it's such a great strategy, especially when you're in the business of creating relationships in order to grow your own business.
Yeah, so that's where the best of episode was great because I was able to feature snippets from a bunch of different people. And so I got some feedback a while back to change. I'd have bookends, kind of the same question at the beginning and the same question at the end. And got some feedback to change what I was doing at the very end. I had been doing kind of a fun thing, asking someone a fun icebreaker questions, but it wasn't necessarily connected to the actual content. And so they said, well, you're trying to help people, not be a martyr to the cause. Ask them about, what tip or, what permission slip would you give to nonprofit leaders to not be a martyr to the cause and build healthier organizational cultures, help them. And so I'm thinking this year for holiday time, my gift back to the listeners will be all of those gifts that the guests have given over the course of the year, maybe not all of them, but a bunch of them. And then again, that gives me another opportunity to tag all those folks on LinkedIn and say, thank you for giving all these gifts to, folks in the sector and your wisdom in terms of how to stay grounded in your leadership and sustainable.
What I'm hearing, and I love this so much, but what I'm hearing is that you're having fun with it.
My God, right? Yes.
And that I think really allows us to be able to show up as our best selves on our podcast because you're not going into it thinking, all right, this is the content I have to create and I have to be consistent because you are so far ahead, right? That's important. If you were like, oh, I need something for next week, you might feel a little differently. But because you're able to explore, have fun, switch things up, and just feel into what feels good and feels exciting, that allows you to be excited about this. Even as you were just talking about changing this, in my head, I'm like, man, if I had to change my whole strategy or change, not my whole strategy, but if I had to change part of my flow, I don't know how I would feel about that, right? So being able to just lean into it, have some fun, and then reconnect it back to your audience and what they need as, being in this sector, but then also tying back into connecting with these folks, I think is just, and keeping yourself top of mind is just so good and such a great strategy. But I love that you're having fun with it.
Yeah, for sure. And that's part of, I think, what inspired me to shift from blogging to podcasting, because I observed, I'm a podcast listener. So I already loved podcasts, and I observed my behavior from listening to different people's podcasts that you do end up with that, what is it called? The parasocial relationship, where as a listener, you think you know the host better than you actually do.
I call it the celebrity
so
effect.
It is,
but yeah.
well, right? Okay. So, you're literally in people's ears. And so I'm listening to these different business leaders and all sorts of different folks, from Krista Tippett and Brene Brown and Tara McMullen and all the folks. For, some I've joined their communities. I've taken, joined a group coaching program with them. And so I saw what I was doing based on what I had learned about the person through their podcast. And I knew that I had never done that for someone based on a blog. And so I was like, oh, okay, this is a different thing. And it's a long game. It's not something that you're planting a tree. You're not planting like an annual.
Yeah.
So it takes a long time and dedication. Over time, it will definitely bring value.
Yes. And have fun with it. Right.
And having fun. Yes, that's definitely, if I didn't enjoy it, I don't think I would have made it to 100.
Yeah. So good. And I love your ideas for the 100 episodes. There are so many fun ways to reconnect, I think, too, with your folks as you get to that 100th episode. We talk about milestone episodes as a way to celebrate instead of download numbers or chart rankings or things like that, because those are just fluffy, arbitrary numbers, right? And rely on other people to be able to show up. But celebrating your ability to show up, I think, is so powerful. And so I love your idea for your 100 episodes, and even tying in those people that were really high quality guests of like, hey, I mentioned this because of your episode. I think can even bring in more people and more tags on LinkedIn. There you go.
Yeah. And, it's not that I don't enjoy the fact that for one point I was number one nonprofit podcast in South Africa. But, why not? That's fun to see that people are downloading it in the Philippines and around the world. That's exciting. And yeah, staying focused on the person on the other microphone.
Yes. So good. Carol, this has been incredible. Thank you so much for sharing all about your podcast and how you were able to use it to create relationships, generate leads for you and your guests. Where can people find you, get to know you, hang out with you if they're in this sector and they are like, oh yeah, I need some help, or I know someone who could use some help? Where can people find you?
Yeah, well, for sure. Check out Mission Impact on all the podcast places and feeds. Check out Mission Impact. I'm at gracesocialsector.com, and you can find me on LinkedIn. My name is pretty common, Carol Hamilton, but I'm the one who hosts Mission Impact. And does equity-centered strategic planning and evaluation for nonprofits. So you can find me there.
Perfect. And we'll make sure that we link all of that in the show notes for anyone who is doing other things while they're listening. Again, Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. This has been a great conversation. I always love talking about podcasts.
Same.